Yeah, so this was kind of, just to start off. Right after high school, I ended up trying to go for like an engineering degree, computer science. Um, this kind of got my feet wet in like the digital design and 3D world. When I was in right after high school, beginning of college, VR was kind of like a newer thing. 3D printing was kind of a newer thing. So these drawings may be a little crude, but this is kind of like what I was dealing with back in 2008, like a little over 10 years ago. This is kind of like what the capabilities of ZBrush used to be. And then that kind of 3D rendering, the idea of like 3D printing and CNC machining, it kind of evolved into like creating bigger things. Machining each part, I 3D printed some of these pieces, and few sculptures. Mainly was right after I finished my first 2 years of engineering school, kind of wanted a little bit more of an artistic approach. So I stopped pursuing my engineering degree and computer science degree and decided to go to art college. So this is kind of my evolution, I guess, from doing a little bit, I started carving out like a life that was a little bit more pre-planned. It was, engineering school can be a little bit dry, and this is kind of my attempt to do something a little bit more creative. A lot of this stuff is like hand done, wasn't really necessarily done with the 3D printer. But there's parts along each project. I sort of learn like new aspects of machining and the capabilities of 3D printing and machining. And in combination with like using your hands and actually like working in a studio. So I kind of wanted to lay out like certain projects that I've done that were kind of heavy with 3D modeling and 3D rendering, 3D scanning, and how you can take those elements and kind of turn them into like a real life sculpture, while still not seriously utilizing like these engineering platforms. You can sort of work with 3D rendering, 3D scanning. It still doesn't have to be exactly precise. There are certain things that I'm gonna kind of lay out that are like pretty heavy in precision and machining, such as like furniture and architecture. That's like, this is kind of the left side of that spectrum, where you can kind of like do a little bit of both. This is like a mermaid that I've done recently at work with ZBrush. Just learning how to texture models. This is kind of like an example of how like I knew ZBrush as a program, but I never really got pretty deep into like how to texturize models and output that into like Maya or Blender. So ZBrush is really cool with like organic modeling. You can kind of think of it as like taking a ball of clay and sculpting it out using the mouse. This is the tail that I was pretty happy about. The job was kind of basically to like model a mermaid, and we're gonna have this 3D printed and then assembled and shot, and then she was displayed in the desert on Marfa, Texas, like an outside art exhibition once a year. So it goes from like me trying to figure out how to texturize a 3D model, figuring out how to do the hair, never done that before. So just examples of how take on a job and you're expected to, do these certain things. It's kind of like a learning process throughout the whole time. Uh, Started getting into hands made, using a new resin 3D printer, getting the body 3D printed. Certain aspects that you don't really need to machine, or you don't really need to 3D print the whole thing. You can outsource certain parts. You can CNC certain parts. This is me CNCing the face. Because I actually wanted it out of wood, so you can kind of sculpt it with 3D prints. You can't really manipulate that much after it's been done. So if you CNC certain parts out of wood, you can kind of finish them after a little bit easier than you can with like a plastic.
What does CNC stand for, or what is CNC?
Yeah, it's means a computer numerical control. It means like anything that's hooked up to like a power tool, like a router. You can piggyback a computer to it to kind of like think of like 3D printing as like an additive where you're actually adding material. CNC is more of like when you hook up a router to something and subtract material from it. Those are kind of like the two schools of thought as far as like machining. Most things are always going to be subtractive, like the CNC. You're always going to start off with like a block. I guess in Greek days, you take like a slab of marble and you just like keep carving away at it. That's the subtractive process, which is like mostly CNC. Nowadays, you can even 3D print, which is the additive. You can even 3D print out of metal, so it's kind of exciting time right now. That so I just started off with like 30 to 40 3D prints and just kind of went at it. Started assembling, gluing them up piece by piece, and eventually this thing was life size. And then once you have the 3D print, you can actually send it out. You can actually take that positive and send it off to get it casted or make a mold out of it. So from this one, we made a mold of the 3D print that was the finished product, and then we actually made a mold out of it. So you can cast it using bronze, or you can cast it. I think this one we were going to use steel. We're going to cast it in steel, which is crazy. A lot of people don't use steel. And then sort of these kind of projects really evolved into like creating furniture. All these pieces. A friend had reached out to me, wanted to create this collection, and he was interested in getting it 3D printed. Mainly because 3D printing can kind of be conceived or perceived as like a sustainable practice. A lot of the filament that we use for 3D printing is corn-based, so it's actually organic. So it breaks down pretty easily. That's something that me and the artists usually try and be conscious of throughout the process. This is something that we've done recently. You can kind of see how it starts off. Just like these really funny mock-ups out of foam. Just how like the design process evolves.
Is it waterproof? The corn?
Yeah. The 3D print is actually waterproof. And that was like a big proponent, especially in outdoor sculptures, because a lot of the times they're made out of wood. So in that case, it wouldn't be weatherproof. 3D print is like plastic. It's not going to biodegrade after probably like 20 or 30 years. is a table that I made recently. This one actually wasn't 3D printed. It was, so this is like an idea of how you can take something that's not completely like 3D printed. I built this table out of wood, which is like a big block, and then I sent it to the machine to basically just finish it off for me. So it's an idea of like how you can still use like hand building skills. You can still be someone who's a carpenter in a shop who's like building these pieces and working in line with machinists or like the 3D modelers. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get to with all these projects is how, I'm not necessarily like a full engineer. I'm not necessarily like a full artist, but the role that a designer takes, in this industry of, 3D fabrication, furniture, and architecture, you can kind of, you can carve out this role as a designer that takes on like aspects of artists and engineering. The table, learning how to paint. Just learning how to put things together using metal. The table I made. The water jet. So this is kind of like a CNC, but it uses water, high pressure water. It's almost like a power washer, like a super strong power washer. It'll cut through pretty much anything that you want, using a stream of water to stand. This is a chair. Mirror. Another chair so this is pretty much how it starts. If you 3D print like each piece, each 3D printer is like probably like 15 inches tall, so you really don't have much to work with. You're really just taking everything, slicing it up, sending it to the printer, and just assembling. This is how it kind of looks before, kind of like putting together a puzzle. This kind of this is the finished product. Table. Ashtray. And then, so I also wanted to go over like certain things that aren't really machined. This is a furniture collection that I put together recently for Design Week. It's like super crude materials. So it's like an assemblage. A friend lives upstate on a farm. He's basically just took items that he found throughout the property, kind of just like assembled them together. And this is a fun project. Just because we weren't really necessarily like honed in on like precision and machining everything exactly the way it should be. It was more just me and the artist in the studio, just trying to figure out materials, what works with each other, taking offcuts from like other projects that he's done. But I kind of wanted to show how there is still a certain extent of like thought that you need to put into these projects, because eventually they're all lamps. They're going to be, they're going to end up in someone's home eventually. So you kind of want to find that balance between, function and this kind of like raw aesthetic that you're going for. Like it's nice to have that visually, but you still want it to be like functional in someone's house. You don't want it to fall over. You don't want, you want the electrical to be proper. So there isn't a fire risk. This is kind of how like we're playing with these items that were like literally found in farm upstate. It's literally like rusted pipes and pieces of wood that we found from his farm, and how it kind of when you put it together finally, kind of paying attention to certain aspects of utility. This is kind of how it can be shown, art gallery in someone's house. So that was like an idea of like the left side of the spectrum, where we're mainly like hand building. There really isn't that much machining, but there is like a certain level of thought and care. And then there's this side, like creating a bench completely, that every single piece needed to be machined exactly right for it to be able to fit together in the end. This is like more of my struggle in this industry, to be honest. I still enjoy like doing these kind of pieces. A little bit more stressful because really, if you don't kind of have like a good idea of like the overall process, and everything isn't exactly right and precise, you're gonna get this thing called like compounding errors. Like one little thing will eventually compound into like a huge error at the end. I mean, this is, I appreciate this level of, this process, but, especially in the end, you can kind of see how like every little detail has to be like thought out and planned. Just cutting the base for this bench that we're making. So I don't know if you guys work with any parametric design software, but that's kind of like the idea of how this bench was made. You can see like a swooping kind of curvature to it. This can actually be designed using just formulas, like literally just math equations. This was done in Rhino. I don't know if you guys have done anything in Rhino yet.
Do you think we can make that in 3ds Max?
Yeah, I think there's a program. It's always going to be like a plugin for like a parametric, to integrate like parametric design into it.
I think we have it actually. Yeah, we do have parametric design. So I think
yeah, I know Rhino. You guys are probably going to learn Rhino eventually. Rhino is basically for architects, furniture designers, and jewelry makers. And I guess you'll kind of see that route, like the more that you work, get your feet wet in these programs, you'll eventually see like ZBrush is mainly for like organic sculpting, and rendering. Blender, kind of the same thing. Maya, it's more for like creating figures from scratch that eventually end up, in a video game or like a high-end rendering. Rhino is more for like design, somewhat like an industrial design software, really. And then you can take what you model in Rhino or in 3ds Max and then export it into ZBrush or Blender and kind of get like the aesthetic that you want. This is the bench that we made recently out of marble. So the last thing I kind of wanted to go over was it's like how these projects, they kind of evolved and in a way where we're taking like aspects of modeling. Like I really learned how to specialize in certain aspects in Rhino of like how to loft certain pieces, especially in like furniture design, like how to create and extrude like these certain parts. and getting like a precise output. So I really never even went to architecture school. I took like a couple semesters right after college, but I never really, like that was never really my thing. So I was always interested in it. And then a friend who was worked with the architecture firm for the vessel, he reached out to me saying he needed a 3D modeler for certain parts. That really weren't capable in AutoCAD. So he reached out to me basically because I learned how to make these parts for this bench. Not the bench I just showed, but another one for Hudson Yards. They really liked how I kind of like specialize in lofting certain parts for it's like kind of like component architecture where you build something in shop and then ship it on site, where you're not actually like building on site. You basically you own a shop and you're fabricating these pieces in parts and then sending them over. That's kind of what I started doing, specializing in. But this is like a good idea of how I took the skills that I learned how to make, or that I gained making furniture and like these precise pieces that fit into each other. How that manifested into doing like 3D drafting for architecture firms. So I made this. So just because I learned how to make this piece for a bench that these architects had seen, I was able to work on pieces of this elevator, soffit, and eventually like pieces of the doorway. This is like a huge building sculpture in Hudson Yards in New York. So it really was like just this piece that I learned how to make. Just learning how to like do it. It's called like a non-planar loft. Something that's a little bit hard, it's pretty difficult in AutoCAD. So they reached out to people who are, somewhat proficient in Rhino. This is literally why I got this job, was that little chamfer loft. That kind of evolved in like architecture projects from there on out. Even I took this software that was like free, open source. We can like do like a faceted design. Just stuff like that. Worked on the Korean Cultural Center recently. This is gonna go up next year. So yeah, these are just examples of how like I'm not, full on engineer, but how I'm like trying to utilize aspects of me as an artist and how that, evolved into me being a 3D designer artist that works and collaborates with, still artists, but also architects and engineers. Some 3D stuff I've done recently. But, I don't really think I'm going to stay completely within architecture. I still enjoy like VR and 3D design. So right now it's just me trying to situate myself somewhere in between those worlds. So yeah, I think that's all I have
That's
as far as
awesome.
me showing everything.
Can we have a round of applause? So you guys have some questions, right? So who wants to ask a question? You guys have any questions? I know I have a lot of questions, but
Yeah.
Dominic, yeah.
Have you ever made something and then like put it in a museum?
Yeah, in a museum.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of this stuff, a lot of the sculptures they end up in museums. A lot of the design work, they'll end up in like showrooms, which kind of like function as art gallery, and like a marketplace. But say for instance, like this one was like technically like an outdoor exhibition, like an outdoor gallery. And a lot of the furniture, yeah, they'll just end up either in someone's house or, you know, um, yeah, just like a kind of like a showroom. But that's kind of like, I guess that's nowadays in the design world is, walking that line between like an art gallery and like a marketplace, but yeah.
Because that's where it gets sold, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not as exciting for the designer, but I guess it is for the artist.
Who has another question? Yeah.
How long did it take to make the film?
How long did it take? What?
To make the mermaid.
Oh, the mermaid was probably about a month going back and forth with the artist. And then once you finally get to a point where you're ready to start production, probably about another 3 weeks with help. It's not, Gee, that one's actually still outside in the desert. I don't know, picture of it.
We could go see it in Texas.
Yeah, it's like literally.
Let's take a
still-
field trip, guys. You have any other questions? Come on, I know you guys have questions. Alex, you have a question? Alex? You don't have any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
How long has he been doing these type of things?
Did you hear that? You want to speak
Yeah,
a little
how long?
louder? How long you been doing it? These type of things?
I mean, I guess like right after high school, I was into, I was into like all the 3D fabrication, but it really wasn't a thing yet. I've kind of been like doing like CAD, which is like computer assisted design, probably for like 10 years. And right when I was in college, I started like the 3D printing fad had started. So that's kind of when it started about 10 years ago, which is crazy. 3D printing has been going. 3D printing is actually, I think it's almost like 20, 30 years old, but it's only been, forefront in the public for like the past 5 to 10 years. So around then, kind of like when it started.
I want to just draw. I think one thing I noticed when you were talking, sometimes you would be figuring things out. Like you would approach a job without being like saying, I am completely certified. I've been doing this for 10 years and I'm I like know this one software, this one thing. It seems like you're pretty young, right? So like in this world, would you say a lot of people, well, my first question is, would you say that it's possible to have the attitude of like, look, like I have this percent of knowledge in this area, but I can actually learn through attempting a project that maybe seem difficult or like that I'll have to grow to succeed to do?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's kind of why it keeps things interesting. I guess they call it like bespoke product design. It's like when you're doing something new every time or something custom. I feel like I've done like industrial design a little bit, and it's just kind of boring after a while. If you start like making the same exact thing day after day. Yeah, that's kind of why it keeps things interesting because you're taking on these projects, it gets kind of stressful knowing that you've never done it completely, you know. That part is really stressful because you're really only, I really, for instance, like with this mirror, I have an idea of like how I'm gonna put this thing together, like how the wood is gonna react to like these certain substrates and glues, paint, but really I've never made it before, so that's one side of it is stressful that, especially to meet deadlines, everything has to like fall in place at the very end. But it's, I'd rather be doing this than making like the same thing every time. Because yeah, you kind of like learn things from each project, and you're not only taking away, like a little bit of a profit, you're also taking away things that you can learn from, carry on to like the next project, which, both of those are equally valuable. Yeah, I don't know how long it's been.
Yeah, and I think we have 5 minutes left. Our period, our period is about to end about in a minute here. But thank you again so much. I think this applies to us a lot, especially since we are in a place where they have an international furniture market every year too. So there's a lot of people that come from around the world every year to, work through projects like this. So again, thank you so much. They just they're about to transition to the next class, but I did record this, so I will be able to show it to other classes as well.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, totally. I'm glad I could do this. Exciting.
Have a great day.
Yeah, you too.
All right, bye.
Bye.